Welcome to my review of Adventure Island for the Game Boy. I believe this game is based off the second game on the NES, though I could be wrong. It's a little confusing to me because I just beat Adventure Island 2 for Game Boy, which seems like that one might be based off Adventure Island 2 for the NES as well, so it's a little hard for me to tell if they're both based off of that game. I'm not really sure, but it's more similar to that than it is to the original Adventure Island on the NES, as far as the visual style and the ability to have an inventory with dragons and things like that you can save up. Though in this game, you cannot go back to previous stages that you beat like you can on Adventure Island 2 for NES and the Game Boy. I have a tutorial up for Adventure Island 2 for the Game Boy and a review, so check those out if interested. And I will drop a link to my tutorial for this game in the description. So aside from that, this is a pretty solid action game, and I would say probably one of the better action games on the Game Boy, just like the second game was for Game Boy. So this is up there at the same level of quality, but with one major issue that does bring it down. The core gameplay, I think, is pretty much on par with that second game, aside from the fact that you can't go back and redo previous stages and farm up items and stuff. You can't do that in this, but aside from that, it's pretty much on par with the Adventure Island 2 for Game Boy, though the bosses are a little bit more simpler as well, so maybe it's a little bit less there, but the thing that takes it down for me is going to be the technical issues. The game is plagued by slowdown the entire time. And you can overlook that to an extent, but the problem is that it's very uneven slowdown. So one moment you're moving at like a somewhat normal speed, then you accelerate out of nowhere. Things like that. And the worst, the most egregious part of that is that sometimes inputs get completely eaten. So you'll be running, you'll make a jump, and the jump doesn't work. The input gets eaten, and you just fall in a hole. So because of that, I had to play slower, more deliberately, which for me makes that a worse game. Even though I can adapt around it, it's worse to me because say you wanted to speed run it and replay the game, it really does kill replayability. Because say you want to do a speed run or no death or whatever, it kind of kills that because you could be trying for a speed run and then you gotta you can't even move at full speed. You gotta slow yourself down deliberately and then hope your inputs don't get eaten. And it just makes it a shittier experience and a lower quality game overall. So that is my main issue with the game. But you can work around it, obviously, but you may take some deaths because of that. So for me, that definitely takes the game down. But other than that, it's a pretty high quality. For the Game Boy especially, it's on par with, some of the better NES games as far as, side-scrolling action. No, it wouldn't be on par with the best NES games. The best NES games have more density of enemies and things like that. But, this does kind of have that core, you know what I mean, of a really good game in this style. But it just doesn't have the enemy density, the challenge or the complexity really to be on par with those games for the NES. But it is very reminiscent of Adventure Island 2 for the NES, or 3 and 4, if you've played those. I have yet to work on those. So you gotta watch out for fucking ostriches and shit, The usual. The bosses are extremely easy. Especially here I was using turbo, so bosses could go down in 2 or 3 seconds. I'm not really hitting the boss yet, but you'll see once I connect with the boss, its health just gets melted. And this one lasts a little bit longer than some of the other boss fights. So, yeah, very fucking easy if you're aggressive, especially if you're using turbo, since I wasn't playing on the original console. But as you can see, I'm showing a demonstration here. You can see a lot of the bosses can be killed almost instantly. So the boss fights are extremely simple. You could do some of that in the second game, but not really too much in the second game for Game Boy, because the bosses took a shitload of hits in that game. And I don't remember being able to really jam hits into them to the same degree. I mean, even if you could, the bosses, they just took a lot more hits. So I think they kind of corrected that. Though some of the bosses in that game were a little bit too long and tedious, but they went a little bit too far in the other direction, I think. But either way. Now, sometimes you won't have a weapon, as you see here, and you will have to make it through a stage without a weapon. Or at least until you can get a weapon later in the stage. Though some stages may never give you a weapon. But you'll usually get it in the next stage. But it's not common. It's not like Adventure Island for NES where there's a number of really hard stages near the end of the game that give you no weapons. It does happen a few times in this game, but the stages are much, much easier. So it's not a huge problem if you don't have a weapon. Adventure Island 2 for Game Boy that I just beat, that game can be harder when you don't have weapons in the stages. And I would say the game is harder overall. It's more complex, I guess. It's a little bit harder, but this game was more frustrating for me because this game, the stages are really easy, but you'll fall in a fucking pit because the controls didn't register. So for me, when you start gimping the controls and crippling the controls, for me that's more annoying to deal with most of the time. I mean, you can work around it, but it's irritating because your controls can kind of go out on you at any moment and not respond. It also adds input lag to the controls and makes them floatier because everything's running so slow all the time. So, you're constantly having to kind of balance that, which you will adjust to, but it'll still catch you off guard occasionally. But you pretty much have your standard enemies. You have Tomahawk, that's the only weapon you can get, and then you got dragons. The rideable dragons sometimes have their own weapons as well, like a projectile. This one that I'm riding here is for water, and it doesn't have any weapon of its own. And then there is a pterodactyl, which can drop bombs, but is really shitty for fighting bosses and things like that. It's not really good for combat, but it can allow you to, if you keep it for a long time, you can actually skip levels by flying over a lot of shit. So it can pull bullshit. So now I'm showing the final 2 stages of the game, and I'll show the final boss. But this is as hard as the game gets, so it really doesn't get too challenging. It's just that, like I said, you may fuck up because your control didn't go through. But as long as you're aggressively firing and moving, we'll take out most of the enemies before they can really do anything in this game. That's the main strat that I used. And then with bosses, I would try to point blank them basically and take them out almost immediately, which is something I pretty much always try to do in these kind of games. And it works very well here. There's not really many safeguards in place to prevent you from doing that. You'll see here the final boss has 2 forms, but they go down really, really fast once you get the position right. So this is the final boss. So you just stand here and do this, maybe jump once, and then you're going to do the same thing again, jump once to dodge the projectile, and that's it for the final boss. But yeah, quite a good game. I'd give it a 7 out of 10. I think it's a solid, good game. But it is really brought down by the technical issues. I probably would have reviewed it a little bit higher if not for the technical issues. But I was able to work around it. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching.